Today, I'm going to talk about how to pick showcases and camps in college recruiting because a lot of these events are money grabs. You probably know that if you've been to some of them. And I want to show you how to pick events that are actually going to be worth your time and money. I've helped hundreds of athletes navigate through recruiting. I've been to dozens of these camps myself. I've been through recruiting twice. And I will tell you that my parents wasted a lot of money on events that did absolutely nothing for me. And I don't want that to happen to you. So I'm going to walk you through the 5 different things that I think about when I think about showcases and camps. And so let's dive right in. Okay. So the first thing that I want you to consider is level of interest. This is the level of interest that schools at that event have in your kid. Because if you're going to events and nobody knows who your kid is ahead of time, you're probably going to waste your money right there and then. Now, we're going to talk about some exceptions to that in a little bit in this video, but in general, you want to establish exposure before the events. You're not using events to get on college coaches' radars. You're going to events so that coaches who already know who your kid is can evaluate them, okay? So you want to attend as many camps as possible for schools who have expressed a higher level of interest. Not all levels of interest are the same, right? If you have an offer from a school that is significantly higher than a level of interest where a school responds to your email or your DM. And so this is where we get into the hierarchy of interest. This is the hierarchy of interest. You basically have this ladder, okay? And what you want to do in recruiting is for every single school, you're going to be starting at the bottom, right? You're going to be starting where you don't have any interest or contact. Schools don't know who you are. And your goal is to move as many schools as possible through the hierarchy of interest all the way to the point where you're getting offers, right? And the more schools that you can do that with, the more offers you're going to have. So what happens is not every single touch point is worth the same, okay? So for instance, the first level above no interest or contact would be a follow on social media. Coaches aren't just going around following random players on social media. If they followed your kid, it's because there was something that they liked. So it's not nothing, but at the same point, it's not a huge level of interest. All they did was click a button. They're not seriously engaged with your kid yet. There's still a lot of ground that has to be made up, but it's not nothing. Then you move to something where they call your coach. They don't have any contact with your kid personally, but they're calling your coach on behalf of basically your kid to see, hey, what does the coach think of your kid? And that would be the next level, right? But they still haven't established personal contact with you yet. So it's still a little bit lower on the totem pole. Then we start to move into personal communication, an email or a DM. These would be the next level of interest. So now you've broken the personal contact barrier, which is great, but it's still not the same level of interest as like a text message or a phone call. If you have a coach's phone number and they've willingly given that to you and opened that dialogue, that communication channel, that's a pretty big deal, right? You're making significant progress with schools. But at the same time, you don't have a visit yet. You haven't been on campus. You haven't seen what that school actually looks like. You haven't shook the coach's hand and met him in person, right? And so that would be the next level until finally you reach the point where you get to an offer. And so when we talk about showcases and camps, you want to go to as many of these as possible for schools where you have higher levels of interest. That would be something where you're like, probably in this category, right? Now, of course, these right here are still higher levels of interest than nothing. So maybe those would be worth considering. But the higher you go on the hierarchy of interest, the more likely it is that an event is going to be worth it for you, right? So the first thing that you should look into is what is the level of interest from all the schools that I've already talked to, right? So the schools that you're communicating with, which ones do you have the highest level of interest? Those should be the events that you are most highly considering, okay? The next thing you should consider is obviously how much do you like the school, right? Because if you don't like a school at all, then maybe it doesn't make any sense. But at the same point, and we're going to talk about this next, is the amount of interest you have. Because if you don't have any interest, then you should still consider a school, even if it's not at the top of your list. Okay. But how much you like the school is important. The more you like a school, the more you should consider going to an event where that school will be in attendance. Now, here's where we get a little bit off track, and there's an exception to the rule. I just told you that you want to use showcases and camps for evaluation, not exposure, right? But this changes a little bit when you have the top schools at your list that you are most excited about. And so this is where you might go to a school's event Even if you aren't already in contact with them, you might use a showcase or a camp as a method of exposure for a very specific kind of school, right? Which would be like one of the schools that's at the top of your list that you've tried to email and they haven't responded. You've tried DMing them and they haven't responded. You've had your coach reach out to them and they haven't responded. You've tried all other methods of communication and you haven't gotten anywhere. Then maybe it's worth your time going to that event simply because it's one of the top schools on your list. And so, what I would say is this works for these top schools, but you don't want this to be your strategy in general for generating exposure. I don't want the idea to be, okay, we're going to go travel all over the country to all these showcases and camps, and that's how we're going to get on college coaches' radars. No, you're going to waste a lot of time and money if you do that. But it's okay to do that for one or two schools, right? Your top schools. It's like, hey, you know what? If you show up on campus and they happen to need your kid's position in grad class and your kid has the weekend of their life and college coaches are watching and all the stars align, then maybe you get interest from your top school and it was because of that event. So it might still be worth it for you. I just don't think all those stars are going to align every single time for every event that you go to, which is why I don't want it to be your primary method of exposure. Okay. So it will also factor in how much you like the school. Now, with that would be the amount of interest that you currently have. The more interest from schools that you have, the more schools that you are currently actively talking to, the less events you might need to attend. Now, it depends on how far up on the hierarchy of interest you are. If you have a bunch of offers from schools, right, then you probably don't need to go to that many events. But if you have a bunch of schools you're talking to, but you're not at that point yet, then you might still need to go to a lot of camps or events, right? Because they have to see you play somewhere. You have to grow their interest on the hierarchy of interest, right? And so the more interest that you have, the less events you might need to attend. But if you are hurting for interest, then you might have to go to events to try and generate exposure. I don't want you going to events for exposure, but if you've tried everything else and it hasn't worked, then you need to do something. And this is one of the options that you can use to try and hopefully generate some sort of interest. But even if showcases and camps are not ideal for exposure, if you're running low on interest and you're late in the process, you might have to consider, I call it pulling the parachute, because it's a gamble. This is not the best way to get on coaches' radars, but if you're struggling to do it with email or DMs, like you're having a hard time generating interest, then you might have to attend more showcases and camps and you might have to bite that bullet, and it's just the way that it goes. But I don't want that to be the first thing that you try and do. I think about it in terms of surgery, right? If you go to the doctor and you say, my leg hurts, they don't go, okay, let's get you into the operating room. They don't do that. They say, okay, well, how long has it been hurting? Where does it hurt? Does it hurt if I touch it here? And then they might say, okay, well, we're going to give you some medication. Take this for a couple weeks, see if it gets better. And then you say, well, it didn't get better. And they say, okay, let's do some x-rays. Let's do an MRI. And then they say, okay, you know what? We're going to do an injection with cortisone or something, right? And then you say, oh, that still doesn't work. The last option is surgery. That's the last option. And I would say in recruiting, using showcases and camps for exposure is like your last resort. That's the last option. It's not what you want to have to do, but you might have to do it if you're running low on interest. If you're not good at generating interest via email or DM or something like that, you might have to resort to this. The fourth thing is proximity. So the closer an event is to you, the more strongly you should consider going. If you're going to drive 2 hours away, you should go to that event almost every time, even if you have a ton of interest, even if you don't really like the school, even if you have a low level of interest from the school, right? Why? Because it's 2 hours. Like that might totally be worth your time and money because it's so close. But when we're talking about a 4-hour flight across the country, now we have a different conversation, right? This is not the same thing. Then if you're going to do a 4-hour flight, right, you better not have a lot of interest. Or you better absolutely love the school, or that school better have shown a pretty high level of interest in you, right? Or your kid. And so you have to compare the proximity of these. How challenging is it for me to be able to get to that event? And then similarly, how much is it going to cost? Because the less expensive an event is, the more that you can consider that event. Now, specifically, I'm not talking about the event fee itself, because a lot of these are going to be roughly similar in cost. Sure, some of them are more expensive or less expensive, but they're mostly going to be similar, right? And so when I talk about costs, I'm talking about auxiliary expenses. That would be be things like flights or rental cars, hotel rooms, food, right? Those would be things where it's like, oh man, if we're going to fly 4 hours, this could end up being a $1,500 weekend, right? If that's going to be the case, then you better be sure that you absolutely need to go, that you like the school, that they have a high level of interest in you, and all of these factors sort of start to come together. And so when you're thinking about showcases and camps, you have to account for how each one of these affects the other one. Because we can't just sit here and say, well, if you have a high level of interest from a school, then you should go to that camp. No, not necessarily, right? Because maybe you don't like the school, or maybe you already have a lot of interests. And so even if they're really interested in you, you don't really need to go, right? Maybe it's far away or it's cost intensive. And so you have to consider how all of these events or how factors basically, sorry, I just had like a total brain fart right there, but you have to consider how all these factors affect one another, right? That's the reality of this. And so when we're thinking about how do we advise someone on what events to go to, this is basically the process that I think of and the questions that I ask. And then we can talk about it. Like we have advising calls, coaching calls with people, right? And we'll say, okay, let me get this information and I can help you make a good decision. But a lot of recruiting is making decisions with insufficient information. You don't have as much information as you want to make a good decision. And so you have to be good at taking a bunch of factors in and then spitting out something simple from something complex. And that's really what we do, right? So if you're the parent of a high school athlete and you're struggling in the recruiting process and you want some help with that, then I'll leave a link in the description. You can schedule a call with us and we'll walk you through what we do. If not, I'll see you guys next time.